And so they were born and raised Taiwanese. Their entire identity is forged in the term of Taiwan, not in mainland China or China. And so there's already a group of distinctive voters, particularly very younger voters, that are moving away already. They're pushing the so-called status quo further and further away from that of mainland China because they simply have no ties with what's happening on the mainland. So I think this group of voters that I'm talking about that are growing their independent identity are going to drive the independence aspect, drive the so-called status quo breaking aspect themselves because they simply have no reason to rely on China in the ways that we potentially associate. For the older generations, they have families, relatives back in China. Taiwan now has a new president. His name is Lai Ching-te from the Democratic Progressive Party. Now, what does this mean for the CCP's agenda to invade Taiwan? And what does it mean for the next 4 to 8 years for the Taiwan and China cross-strait relationship? Let's talk about this. Welcome to China Insider, I'm David Zhang. Today, the Taiwanese people in an election voted to continue 4 more years of the Democratic Progressive Party, or the DPP's policies, in a new president named Lai Ching-te and his running mate, former ambassador to the US, Vice President-elect Selby Kim. His win rides off the hard stance towards the CCP in the DPP, and that's what led to his victory. However, they did lose the legislative majority in the Yuan, which is the lawmaking body in Taiwan. Losing to the majority means that the agenda of the party, as well as his presidency, will be very much hindered by a coalition formed by the two oppositions. This roadblock was clear at their victory speech press conference. Lai Ching-te and Selby Kim did not look too happy, and they openly said that they will be going back and examining the loss of the majority in the Yuan. Given now that the legislature's balance of power is split into 3 parties, given the introduction of the TPP, there is going to be a coalition of opposition formed that will lead to the majority opposing most of Lai's agenda in the coming 4 years. The goal here is likely to stall his 4 years of presidency, as well as to prevent him from going in what they're calling too pro-independence in Lai's agenda. These will include Lai's plan to fortify the foreign policy changes, potentially even when it comes to military spending and military readiness. But that's an area we have to watch for. Still, this is a huge problem, the victory of Lai for the Chinese Communist Party. First, holding elections in Taiwan at all is already breaking the so-called status quo of the cross-strait relationship. Having an election every 4 years to choose a president, to have 3 candidates debating over said presidency is essentially defeating the entire narrative of the so-called that Taiwan is a China internal issue. Because China's mainland, you can't have real elections to begin with. And that's the huge irony here. For 40 years, we've seen Taiwan move from an authoritarian government into a democratic voting system, and with each election cycle, we see a clear contrast here between what's happening on the mainland, which is getting more and more totalitarian as we speak, to that of a democratic, free country system that's in Taiwan. And that itself, the contrast between the two different systems, is a legitimacy issue for the existence of the Chinese Communist Party. Think about it. Why must billions of people live under a totalitarian system when in fact we see millions live the clear opposite and enjoying the freedoms that come with it? Of course, the CCP tries to propagandize their version of so-called whole process democracy or people's democracy. It's just they're twisting the definition of the term democracy and nothing else. But that's all they can do. Because the very idea of Taiwan's existence contrasts and calls into question the legitimacy of the Chinese regime, that itself is a big argument in terms of what the CCP is going to do next. But before we talk about that, because the more chances people get to vote over the years, right? The next election, the election after, the more people in Taiwan are moving away from the ties to the mainland. Here's why. Now, you have already a group of voters in Taiwan who were born and raised, learned the language, spoke, eating, learning the history and everything that's just Taiwan. They don't have the association and the historic ties with mainland China. And so they were born and raised Taiwanese. Their entire identity is forged in the term of Taiwan, not in mainland China or China. And so there's already a group of distinctive voters, particularly very younger voters, that are moving away already. They're pushing the so-called status quo further and further away from that of mainland China because they simply have no ties with what's happening on the mainland. In fact, if you look at the state of Asia, right, in East Asia particularly, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, now Taiwan, these debunked the argument that Eastern Asian culture cannot function in a democracy. They have a very functional democracy in place. And this actually defeats the entire argument from the CCP, which says that, oh, they cannot function, they need a leadership, a totalitarian one, that is. So the question becomes, does this call into a higher chance or a lower chance of China planning a military invasion? Well, I actually want to say the argument is really about chances, because the plan to invade has always been on the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party. They prepared two methods, right? So the so-called peaceful unification by co-opting society in Taiwan to work with grassroots organizations that are pro-CCP, amplify their voice in the Taiwanese society. The other side is, of course, if this option doesn't work out, they'll use a military plan. So it doesn't matter who's in power, which party is the president, that plan has never changed. Of course, the invasion is going to be very costly because the involvement of the United States, Japan, the Philippines, as well as Korea even, and to some extent Australia, but they're much further away, that is going to be a very costly move by the CCP. So it is the final straw or the final option, so to speak. What the CCP will continue to do despite the win with Lai Ching-te is that they're going to continue to amplify the pro-China voice in Taiwan, particularly influencing the politicians who are elected to make laws in the legislative yuan and to stop the agenda of Lai Ching-te, to sort of, you have to stop the agenda here before that they can weaken the society to a point where they can invade, or maybe they can even do so without firing a shot. But given what we know about China's domestic situation, like I've often said, that this is really not a well-prepared plan. You know, we're looking at potentially a dangerous time this year, given the fact that they just elected a more hardline president in Taiwan. But the very fact that is today you have to have a booming domestic economy if you want to have the power to invade. Of course, this isn't to say that they won't provoke some trouble by flying planes over Taiwan's airspace or to sail some naval ships across or encircling Taiwan to show the aggressive posturing. But again, my current assessment is that they're likely not going to invade for the next years or so because of the domestic situation. But this election does come in an important key point in the timeline, right? Most U.S. officials, military officials in the Pacific Command, as well as generally many thinkers and scholars believe that 2027, before or during, is when China will likely invade. So Lai Ching-te's term will last from 2024 to 2028. So if something does happen, he is the presiding president over the war, if that comes to it. And so his election really is very important in what the agenda for Taiwan looks like for the next 4 years, which you could argue is most critical. Of course, Lai Ching-te is continuing the last 8 years under President Tsai Ing-wen. His win is basically continuing the path that they've already walked on for maintaining the status quo. So if there was no war in the last 8 years, the chance of a war happening in the next 4 is not going to be that much higher, considering nothing dramatic is going to be changed in the next 4 years to come. Right? The existing policy is very simple: move away from the CCP, be closer to the United States, try to gather military preparedness in Taiwan by buying up weapons, as well as preparing the military against a potential invasion. And soon we'll actually be getting a report from the Taiwanese government on the extent of the election meddling by the CCP into this particular election. And so we'll get more ideas into how much this election was importance-wise to the CCP, but also how much they've really done. Now, this may be giving a clear-eyed view for the CCP to say that their peace unification plan may not be working, that they should be preparing for the other way. But this, I think, is still a little bit too early to say. But like I said earlier, this is why I'm also optimistic about the state of Taiwan, because the more elections we have, the more chances voters are going to express their own beliefs in a world where Taiwan is an unique, independent body that's not tied up with the identity of the mainland. So as those two identities shift away from each other, the CCP is, of course, stuck in the historical past of 1949, right? They're still stuck on the idea that there's a CCP versus a KMT, whereas the people in Taiwan, they've already moved on to, now we have 3 parties, and the identity of the KMT today, of course, is much different than that of 1949. This is no longer just a cross-strait party-to-party difference. This is now 2 identity difference. So I think this group of voters that I'm talking about that are growing their independent identity are going to drive the independence aspect, drive the so-called status quo breaking aspect themselves, because they simply have no reason to rely on China in the ways that we potentially associate. For the older generations, they have families, relatives back in China. So to conclude, the most important part is that Lai Ching-te is the next president, and he's got some important work to do, particularly with building up the military preparedness and military readiness. And that's, again, fighting against trying to communicate with the other two parties who are likely going to form a coalition majority against Lai Ching-te, to tell them that they need to beef up Taiwan's defense, at the same time minimize the pro-CCP voices in Taiwan. So there's a lot of work ahead, but here are just some of my thoughts for today's victory for the DPP. All right, if you enjoyed the content, leave a like, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. All right, until next time, this is China Insider. Bye-bye.